He had this to say. He had this to say. And remember Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka is the country in which the war between the government and the Tamil Tigers has just come to an end after 25 years. Just come to an end. He had this to say. He said, if your problem is geography, proportional representation might help you. But if your problem is race, don't touch it. Don't touch it. It will accentuate the racial problem, and the last state will be worse than the first. That is what he had to say. I was there. And other prominent citizens from Trinidad and Tobago were present to hear that contribution. And the minute he said it, an African country got up and said, we introduced proportional representation a few years ago, and we're now trying to get out of it. Somebody from Australia got up and said the same thing. It's only in Trinidad and Tobago where some of the politicians feel that the people are foolish, that they could come to you and put that over, and especially with the composition of the society as it is today. It is 42% East Indian. It is 38% citizens of Trinidad and Tobago of African heritage. It is 18% mixed, and it is 2% whites, Chinese, Syrian, Lebanese, and so on. That is the composition today. The minute you go by a system of proportional representation, the tendency of politicians to campaign on the basis of race is too strong for some of our politicians to resist. That is what is going to happen. You're going to have the country being polarized on the basis of race. And that is another reason, my dear friends, why in electing a president in this society, you do it utilizing the American method of an electoral college rather than on a straight first-past-the-post system because of the composition of your society. You don't do that. They will come to you and tell you all kinds of things. You don't do that. You don't do that. So, coalition governments are inherently unstable, and proportional representation leads to coalition governments. But like I say, there's a second aspect to that, the government itself. If fellas don't know how to behave, if people don't know how to behave, you could have whatever system you want. You could have whatever system you want, man just don't know how to behave. I'm not calling any names. You either could behave or you can't. My dear friends, in the year 1998, I think it was, the government of the day, the UNC, brought a proposal to Parliament designed to establish parliamentary committees and to make Parliament, to give Parliament a greater oversight function over the work of the executive. It is a very laudable objective, but the PNM opposed it. You know why? The PNM opposed it because we thought that the approach in the current system of government could not work. Where did that idea come from? That idea came from Westminster in the United Kingdom. In the British Parliament today, in the House of Commons, which is the lower house, our House of Representatives, in the House of Commons, there are 646 parliamentarians. The Labour Party, which is in government, has 349 of those seats. The number of people who hold appointments as ministers or parliamentary secretaries or ministers of state from the lower house is 24. So you have 325 people in the British House of Commons who are backbenchers. And what the British authorities thought is that they were getting into too much trouble with these backbenchers all the time. The fellows were prone to revolt. Revolt started on the backbenches of the government all the time. So they decided to set up a system that will give the backbenchers a greater say in the conduct of governmental affairs. And to do it, respecting the separation of powers by giving the Parliament an oversight responsibility on the work of the executive. So that they could set it up involving people who are not members of the executive. What do we have in Trinidad and Tobago today? In our lower house, we have 41 seats. 26 of those seats are controlled by the PNM. Of the 26 seats, 22 members, about 22 members are members of the executive. 22 of the 26. So the number of backbenchers you have is 4. The number of backbenchers you have is 4. If, therefore, you want to set up an oversight arrangement involving the executive to do it properly, you have to use people who have appointments. In other words, you have to use members of the executive to oversee the work of the executive itself. It is Caesar unto Caesar, and it is a system that cannot work properly, and that is why the PNM voted against it. But the PNM didn't vote against the idea. We voted against the mechanism. It just couldn't work. To be able to make such an idea work in Trinidad and Tobago, you have largely to separate the executive from the legislature to a great extent. As it now stands, and there are those who argue that this is the learning tells you, that in a system such as the one that we have, where you have so many members of the executive, the legislature, the separation of powers principle is not strictly observed, and that you run the risk of one encroaching on the next, of one dominating the next, the executive dominating the parliament, and all that goes with that, the tyranny that Montesquieu talked about when he enunciated this principle of separation of powers in 1748. You have that. So what is now being proposed is this: a parliament where the ministers come largely from outside of the parliament. See, what the draft working document says is that the leader of government business is a member of the cabinet by virtue of that, and that the government can have up to 3 more people as members of the executive, not necessarily members of the cabinet. They could be parliamentary secretaries, they could be ministers of state. A maximum of 4 people, a maximum of 4 people coming from the lower house, and a same number from the upper house. It could be 4, it could be 3, it could be 2, it could be 1, it can't be less than 1, because the leader of government business in the lower house and the leader of government business in the Senate are both members of the cabinet. That is what the working document proposes. Let us take a situation, my dear friends, where if the parliament is configured as it is configured today, where you have 26 people in the lower house on the government side, and you can select 4 of them to be in the executive, it means that you have 22 of them who are not from the government side, and therefore you now have enough people to set up a proper system of parliamentary oversight where you can set up committees, and these committees can oversee the work of the executive in certain specific areas, and you don't run into the risk and run the problem that you now have, where in the parliament as it is constituted, members of the executive are given the opportunity to oversee their own work. It just cannot work in principle. It is fundamentally flawed. So the new approach is by far a more superior approach, and it is one that respects to a far greater extent the principle of the separation of powers. Do you understand it? I'm not so sure. Oh, I thought I was talking to myself. Well, if you understand it, say yay, yay. All right, let's go. So there you have it. In the Senate, well, before I get to the Senate, let me tell you what the working document proposes. It proposes 6 standing committees of the parliament. One is a committee that oversees the work of government departments, ministries, and local government bodies, a standing committee that does that. This is a joint select committee of both houses. The second committee looks at statutory bodies and government-controlled state enterprises. A third committee looks at foreign affairs. You know why foreign affairs? Because foreign affairs is fundamental to the way you locate your country in the international community. And one of the things you want to do is you want to depoliticize that, so that you bring the opposition into a committee with the government, and on an ongoing basis you discuss this question of foreign affairs so that the opposition understands what you're doing and why, so that if the government changes, it is less likely that the foreign policy of the government will undergo any significant change. There will be continuity in the foreign policy prescriptions of the state. And similarly in energy, because the fourth committee is one to look at energy policy. When you do that, energy is too important to the economic well-being of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And energy policy must be depoliticized. Energy policy should be the subject of discussion at a parliamentary committee as between the government and the opposition. And just for the record, independent senators. The fifth one is public accounts, the Public Accounts Committee. And the sixth one oversees the work of the service commissions other than the Judicial and Legal Service Commission in the exercise of certain of their functions, the service commissions.